right, let's talk about the heart. So this is chapter 12. In chapter 12, we're going to talk all things heart. We have covered previously blood and the rest of the cardiovascular system, so blood vessels. Now we are going to talk about the heart and complete the cardiovascular system. So the base of the heart, this is where the heart resides in the thoracic cavity. Base of the heart is this kind of diagonal region between the two chambers, the atria here and the ventricles here. So the base is kind of the superior portion. The apex is where it comes to a point, and it kind of sits on a diagonal in the thoracic cavity. And there's 3 layers to the heart. So there's an outer layer that's a serous membrane, and serous membranes secrete fluid that covers the outer surface of the heart. It's called the epicardium. It's also named the visceral pericardium. So the peri, again, means around, cardio is heart, epi is on top of. So there's a membrane that is directly connected to the heart, but it's protective. The myocardium, think myo is muscle. So the muscle of the heart is mostly what makes up the heart. And this is the cardiac muscle tissue that contracts and relaxes to pump blood. The endo, think endo is inner or within, is endocardium is a layer of simple squamous epithelium that lines the inner surfaces of the heart and including the valves. The pericardium is actually made up of 2 serous membranes. So the pericardial sac surrounds the heart. There's the visceral pericardium or epicardium that lines the heart directly. The parietal pericardium is what forms the outer wall of the cavity that the heart resides in. And the parietal pericardium is the pericardial sac. In between those 2 layers, those 2 membranes secrete fluid, serous fluid, that helps protect the heart. And as the heart moves around, basically contracts and relaxes, it's able to do that without producing friction by rubbing up against the body cavity. So it's a protective layer of both membrane and also fluid. So here's what it looks like. If you cross-section the heart, so if you take this little cross-section here and blow it up, there's the endocardium. It's a layer of simple squamous epithelium with a thin layer of connective tissue that anchors that simple squamous epithelium in place. The myocardium is the big thick layer, all muscle. And look at this myocardium. These are all cardiomyocytes, heart muscle cells. Right there's one cardiomyocyte. Look at how it branches. That's a pretty unique characteristic to cardiomyocytes, is that they branch. And right here is the epicardium on top of the heart, or the visceral pericardium, and then the parietal pericardium. So these are 2 membranes, and membranes are made up of a layer of epithelium with some connective tissue deep to that as well. So right here, the space between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium is the pericardial cavity, the cavity in which that fluid is secreted, the serous fluid. So that cavity is kind of, there's an analogy that basically somebody's sticking their fist into a balloon. That's what the pericardial cavity, or how it's created. So there's one big membrane that is the visceral and parietal pericardium, but then the heart just kind of pokes down into that. So right here, this outermost layer is the pericardial sac, or the parietal pericardium. The space in here is the pericardial cavity, and then this thin layer here is the visceral pericardium. So it kind of looks like this. There's visceral, parietal, and the pericardial cavity. Cardiac muscle tissue, so cardiomyocytes, they have a single nucleus and they branch. And the branching in cardiomyocytes is what helps them basically function properly. And that function is really important, and branching is what allows these cells to communicate to one cell to communicate to multiple cells in just a short period of time. And in doing that, when one cardiomyocyte connects its membrane to the next cardiomyocyte, that happens at a structure called an intercalated disc. And on the figure here, you can see this is an intercalated disc. I'll show you a better version of this. This is just what it looks like under a microscope. So between 2 cardiomyocytes is an intercalated disc. Within intercalated discs, there's two important structures we'll talk about here shortly. So cardiomyocytes are only found in the heart. They're heart muscle cells. They are striated, and basically they're striated because of the overlapping of the thick and thin filaments in the muscle. So cardiomyocytes have sarcomeres, just like the skeletal muscle would have a sarcomere. And they depend upon aerobic metabolism, meaning they need a lot of oxygen. So there's lots of mitochondria. Looks like my slide's a little messed up here. It's missing. There it is. I don't know what that is. Okay. These intercalated discs are basically where the plasma membranes of two cardiomyocytes just intertwine with one another, and that stabilizes positions of those two cells. Within an intercalated disc, you can find two structures: a gap junction. Gap junctions are one type of cell-to-cell communication molecule that allows ions to move from one cell to the next, so that it provides an electrical connection. Remember, action potentials kind of simplify down to the movement of sodium and potassium across the membrane. So this sodium, as it diffuses into a cell, it can basically propagate the action potential from one cell to the next through a gap junction, because it's basically just a small little pore from one cell to the next. So the action potentials can travel from basically across an intercalated disc from cell to cell through a gap junction, because sodium ions are able to diffuse through that gap. Desmosomes are another type of cell-to-cell junction that basically are a physical connection from one cardiomyocyte to the other. So it anchors the two cells together. So we're going to talk about some external features of the heart. We talked about cardiomyocytes, and now we're going to talk about some more gross anatomy related to the heart, so you can kind of tell which side is anterior versus posterior and left versus right. So the anterior surface, on the right, there are 4 chambers in the heart: 2 atria towards the base and 2 ventricles near the apex. The right and left atria have a thin wall that can expand, and the expandable portion of the atrium is called an auricle. Kind of looks like an ear. So think auricle like an ear. There are a couple of sulci, so shallow grooves that mark boundaries between the chambers. There's one called the coronary sulcus, and that marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. And that coronary sulcus has adipose tissue, so fat tissue, but that's also where the coronary arteries, the blood supply to the heart, basically run through those sulci. And there's an anterior and posterior interventricular sulcus that is between the ventricles, interventricular. Between the ventricles, there's a sulcus between the two, and that marks the boundary between the two ventricles. There's another structure called the ligamentum arteriosum that anchors together 2 really important vessels, two of the larger vessels that branch off of the heart. One's called the pulmonary trunk that carries blood to the lungs from the heart, and the other is the aorta that carries blood from the heart to everywhere else in the body. And that ligamentum it's a ligament, but prior to birth, it was actually an opening between those 2 structures, those 2 vessels. And that was important in fetal circulation, but after birth, that's no longer needed, and it closes off and becomes a ligament. So here's what it looks like. So here's the coronary sulcus, and there's the right coronary artery we'll talk about later. So remember I said some of the coronary vessels basically run through this sulcus, this groove. And here's the anterior interventricular. So there's the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So the anterior interventricular sulcus is between the 2. Right here's the right atrium, and this would be the auricle. This is the expandable portion of the right atrium, and the left auricle, which is the expandable portion of the left atrium. So there's some extra space there for blood to fill those chambers before they contract and pump blood from the atrium into the ventricles. And this would be then the pulmonary trunk here and the aortic arch. So this is the aorta. Right here is the connection between the 2, the ligamentum arteriosum. On the posterior surface, there's some pulmonary veins that you can see. The right atrium has connection to the coronary veins. So there's two big coronary veins, and think coronary as heart. That's the circulation, the blood that's provided to the heart. In the vena cava, you can see there's the coronary sinus we're going to talk about, and the posterior interventricular sulcus. So take a look at the posterior side of the heart. Right here are the superior and inferior vena cava that empty blood into the right atrium. There's the coronary sinus. So blood flow to the heart from the coronary arteries makes its way back to the right atrium through the coronary sinus. This is the major coronary vein in coronary circulation. On the left atrium, you have two pulmonary veins on either side. And then you can see the posterior interventricular sulcus between the right ventricle and left ventricle. If you notice, the posterior interventricular sulcus is pretty vertical when it comes to the layout of the heart, whereas, I'm going to flip back a couple slides, the anterior interventricular sulcus runs at a diagonal along the heart. That's an easy way to tell anterior from posterior in the heart. These coronary vessels that I keep mentioning, they supply blood to the heart. The heart has a huge job. It supplies blood to everywhere in the body, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the brain, the lungs, everywhere in the body. But it's muscle mostly, so it needs its own oxygen supply. So the myocardium is supplied oxygenated blood by the coronary circulation, basically through two major coronary arteries, and they branch off of the ascending aorta. So take a look here. Right here is the ascending aorta. This figure has removed the pulmonary trunk, so you can see the left coronary artery right here. So the left coronary artery branches off of the aorta, where there's tons of oxygenated blood. And then it's very short because it splits right here to the circumflex artery that runs around between the left atrium and left ventricle, and the anterior interventricular artery that runs down the anterior interventricular sulcus. The right coronary artery branches, I'm going to go back a slide, is right here is the right coronary artery that runs all the way around the coronary sulcus, basically, and around the heart between the atrium and ventricle. And then on the posterior side, right here is where it comes around and branches into the posterior interventricular artery that runs along the posterior interventricular sulcus. And along the way, there are some what's called marginal arteries. So right here is a marginal artery. There's one pointed out on the left side. Here is a marginal artery. There's several marginal arteries that branch off the coronary vessels. With regard to coronary veins, so where blood is supplied to the heart by the two major arteries, the left and right coronary artery, there's some veins that then take deoxygenated blood and send it back to the right atrium. The anterior cardiac veins here are draining blood and sending them back to the coronary sinus, the major drainage vessel for the veins. And right here is the great cardiac vein. Those are what you can see anteriorly. And the great cardiac vein runs in the coronary sulcus between the left atrium and left ventricle. And where you can see it on the posterior side, here's where the great cardiac vein comes around, merges in with the posterior cardiac vein, and becomes the coronary sulcus. Coronary sinus, not sulcus. So you've got the posterior cardiac vein on the left ventricle, the middle cardiac vein in the posterior interventricular sulcus. They all merge around. The small cardiac vein also comes around, and they all merge into the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is the major vessel that drains deoxygenated blood from the heart into the right atrium. So the right atrium is blue because it's always deoxygenated blood that makes its way there. So deoxygenated blood is designated as blue in figures. Whereas the left atrium is oxygenated blood, so it's red. The chambers of the heart. The atria pump blood into the ventricles. There is a septum, a wall between the two atria called the interatrial septum between the atria. That wall is just muscle. Like the interventricular septum separates two ventricles, also muscle. The valves, so two walls separate the atria and ventricles, the interatrial septum and interventricular septum. That separates the right and left atria and the right and left ventricle. But what separates the atria from the ventricles are the atrioventricular valves. Think atrioventricular, the atria and ventricles have a structure between them that separates them. And these valves allow blood to flow in only one direction, from atria to ventricles. They will close to prevent the backflow of blood from ventricles into the atria. So let's talk about the atria of the heart, because we're going to go chamber by chamber and talk about some features, potentially some unique features in each chamber. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the superior and inferior vena cava, and like I mentioned earlier, from the coronary sinus, which is deoxygenated blood coming back to the right atrium from the coronary circulation, the blood flow to the heart. The fossa ovalis is another structure similar to the ligamentum arteriosum that once was an opening, but then closes off after birth. So remember I said the ligamentum arteriosum once was a hole between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta in the fetus, in fetal circulation, but that actually isn't needed after birth, so it closes off. The same thing happens, or the same concept occurs with the fossa ovalis, and you can see an indentation in the right atrium, in the wall of the right atrium. It's basically where the interatrial septum is located. And that indentation once was an opening in fetal circulation to allow blood flow from the right atrium to the left atrium, which is no longer needed after birth. So it closes off and becomes the fossa ovalis. A fossa is just an indentation, whereas a foramen is an opening or a hole. So that's found in the right atrium, in the interatrial septum, really. Pectinate muscle forms ridges in the anterior atrial wall in the inner surface of the auricle. So, and remember, that's the flap that looks like an ear that is expandable so that blood can fill the atria completely. So that pectinate muscle is located in the anterior portion and the auricle of both atrium. In the left atrium, that receives oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. So the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood coming back to the heart, as veins take blood back to the heart from the superior and inferior vena cava and from the coronary sinus. The right atrium then pumps blood to the right ventricle. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. So think they're coming from the lungs. That should be oxygenated blood, right? So the pulmonary veins are bringing oxygenated blood to the left atrium, and then the left atrium pumps blood to the left ventricle. So here's where this happens. Take a look at some of this anatomy here. So here's the right atrium. Right here's the right auricle. So this is all pectinate muscle in the anterior portion of the atrium. There's the fossa ovalis. Here's remember the ligamentum arteriosum and fossa ovalis were once in fetal circulation openings. They close off after birth. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the superior and inferior vena cava. That empties right into here. And then the right atrium pumps blood to the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular valve. So right here and here and here are cusps of the valve that allow blood to flow into the ventricle, but don't allow blood to flow back up into the atria. So these valves will close to prevent the backflow of blood into the atrium in the wrong direction. We always want blood to flow in the direction of these arrows, into the atrium, down into the ventricles, and then here is the pulmonary trunk where blood will flow out of, be pumped out of the right ventricle and out to the lungs. And that's all deoxygenated blood, right? It's kind of this bluish purple color. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary veins, two on the left side and two on the right side. You can't see them, they're underneath here. And that oxygenated blood coming from the lungs is pumped from the atria into the ventricle through the left atrioventricular valve. It's also called the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. Blood flows into that ventricle, and then when the ventricle contracts and pumps blood out through the aorta, the AV valve closes and allows blood to flow in the right direction through the aorta and out to the body. So a couple other structures here. There's the interventricular septum between the two ventricles, right? The wall between them. The interatrial septum is, you can kind of see it here, but it separates the right and left atrium. So there's walls between the atria, walls between the a wall between the ventricles, and then valves between the atria and the ventricles. The right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the AV valve, something I mentioned. It's also called a tricuspid valve. It has three cusps, three flaps to the valve of just connective tissue. And there's little tendinous cords, tendinous fibers that connect the cusps of the valves down into the ventricle. They're called chordae tendineae, and they anchor the cusps of the valves in place so the cusps of the valves don't flap back up into the atria and allow blood to flow in the wrong direction. Those chordae tendineae originate in the ventricles at papillary muscles. A papillae is like a bump or a little tiny mountain. So those papillary muscles are little bumps, papillae, in the ventricles that attach and anchor chordae tendineae into place. And all of that holds the valve in place and prevents it from flapping back up into the atria. When the ventricle contracts, blood exits the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve. It's also called the pulmonary semilunar valve because the cusps of the valves are shaped like partial moons, half moons, semilunar. And then blood flows through that valve into the pulmonary trunk. A unique feature of the right ventricle is called the moderator band. And that moderator band is only in the lower portion of the right ventricle. And that allows the papillary muscles to tense just before muscle contraction in the ventricle, and that prevents basically the cusp of the valves from slamming shut. So we'll take a look at that on the next slide. The left ventricle is much thicker. The outer wall of the ventricle is much thicker because it has to produce more pressure to push blood through the entire systemic circuit. So we talked about the systemic circuit versus the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit is just blood flow through blood vessels to and from the lungs and the heart. Not very far to go does that blood have to. Blood flow from this in the systemic circuit has to leave the heart and head everywhere else in the body. So it needs a lot of pressure built up to do that. A thicker muscle is a stronger muscle. So the left ventricular wall is much thicker than the right so that it can produce and generate more force and pump that blood to everywhere in the body. That left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium by way of the atrioventricular valve. It's also called the bicuspid because it has two cusps instead of three, like the tricuspid on the right side, or it's also called the mitral valve. The aorta contracts and pumps blood through the aortic valve, which is also the aortic semilunar valve. Similar to the pulmonary semilunar valve, the cusp of the valves, there's three cusps of the valve, and they are shaped like a half moon, and sends basically blood exits through the left ventricle through that valve while it's open and into the aorta, the largest artery in the body. Muscular ridges on the inner surface of the right and left ventricles are called trabeculae carneae. So let's take a look at that again. So here's the right ventricle. There's the tricuspid valve. Blood is pumped from the atria into the ventricles through the tricuspid valve, three cusps on the right side. And right here is the moderator band in the right ventricle. That moderator band communicates to the papillary muscles. If a muscle in the ventricle is connected to the chordae tendineae, these tendinous cords here, it is a papillary muscle. And that muscle contracts and pulls on the cords to keep the integrity, to basically hang on to the cusps of the valves so they don't flap back up into the atria as the ventricles contract and increase, basically pump blood out through these vessels. Blood shouldn't flow back up into the atrium. And the moderator band's only found on the right side, in the right ventricle. All of these muscular structures in here that are not papillary muscles are called trabeculae carneae. Right here, it's pointed out on the figure. So there's a papillary muscle. Here's a papillary muscle. There's 3 and 4 papillary muscles. Everything else in the ventricle is trabeculae carneae. What else do I want to say here? I think that's kind of it. Oh, the valves. Right here's the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the right ventricle will pump blood out through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk. And that pulmonary trunk branches to right and left pulmonary arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, right? The left ventricle pumps through the aortic semilunar valve. You can see a little tiny piece of the cusp here, out through the aorta. When the valves are open, when the ventricles are relaxed, the chordae tendineae are loose and the atrioventricular valves are open. Blood flows from the atria to the ventricles, and pressure in the pulmonary and systemic circuit basically is what keeps the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves closed. So while the ventricles are relaxing, they're filling with blood. It's really important. The AV valves are open, letting blood flow from the atria into the ventricles. But the semilunar valves are closed at that time, so blood doesn't continue right through the heart and make it less efficient. But at the same time, blood is flowing into the coronary arteries. So when these valves are open, right here are the atrioventricular valves, left side, right side, the semilunar valves are closed. So right here, you've got the left atrium, blood is flowing from left atrium to left ventricle through the left atrioventricular valve, or bicuspid or mitral valve. This aortic semilunar valve is closed. So blood is filling the ventricle, and you need to fill the ventricle with as much blood as possible before the ventricle contracts and pumps blood out to the aorta. When the ventricles are contracted, there's a lot of pressure buildup in the ventricles, and that pressure wants to push blood back up into the atria. To prevent that, the cusps of the atrioventricular valves basically close off the opening between the atria and the ventricles. The papillary muscles contract to tense on the chordae tendineae, and that prevents basically the cusp of the valves from flapping back up into the atria. So as ventricular pressure increases, that also forces open the semilunar valves and the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, and blood flows from the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So here's this picture. When pressure in the ventricle increases and blood flows down a pressure gradient. As pressure increases in the ventricle, as the muscle contracts in the wall here, the atrioventricular valves snap shut, close, and basically catch the blood from flowing back up into the atria. And that allows blood to flow out of the ventricles only through the semilunar valves. So right here's the aorta. An open valve and a closed valve. I think this is super cool, where you can actually see the cusp of the semilunar valve all closed off. Blood is not able to flow through here back into the ventricle. So where my cursor is the aorta. Underneath here would be the left ventricle. And the closing of those valves is what causes our heart sounds, the lub-dub. When you listen to your heart and you hear lub-dub, 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 it's basically that sound is produced because the valves in the heart are closing. And the first heart sound is heard when the atrioventricular valves close. That marks the start of ventricular contraction. The second sound, the dub sound, S2, heart sound 2, occurs when the semilunar valves close. And there's a couple of other sounds, but those are not something we usually talk about. So you'll see on the recording, sound 1, lub, sound 2, dub. Those coronary blood vessels are so important because they supply blood to the heart, which is pumping blood to everywhere in the body. So the coronary circulation, if it becomes blocked, beyond the site of blockage, the muscle in the wall of the heart can die off. Basically what happens is it's coronary artery disease. So if you've ever heard of coronary artery disease, you now know what these coronary arteries actually are. The right and left coronary arteries and what they branch to, some of the major branches. And if you are cutting off blood supply to the muscle of the heart, then you can basically inhibit cardiac function. And you're in big trouble. Reducing blood supply to the myocardium, the muscle of the heart, results in coronary ischemia, and that's basically a cutting off of blood flow. That can be caused by plaque buildup in one of the vessels, which basically plugs off or reduces the size of the vessel internally, the passageway through the vessel, the lumen, and then it makes it easier for a blood clot to get stuck and cut off blood flow completely. And that can lead to a heart attack. So take a look at here. This is such a cool picture. So here's normal blood flow through coronary circulation, right? And here's where blood flow gets cut off by coronary artery disease. This is insane to me, how little blood flow is getting to this heart. That heart's in trouble. To treat coronary artery disease, you can do a couple things. You can put a little tiny balloon into the vessel, and that helps remove the plaque. Basically, just breaks up the plaque and allows it to be circulated on. Or you can put in a stent that prevents, and after that, you put in a stent to prevent the redevelopment of a plaque. And that stent is basically a little wire tube that keeps the vessel wide open and prevents plaques from forming. And here's where, there's a picture here. Right there is a stent. So this would have been where blockage had been previously. And that looks like the right coronary artery. And that stent just keeps the vessel open so that blood can continue to flow through it and provide oxygenated blood to the vessels or to the wall of the heart. Okay, so that is part 1. There's 2 more to go. So I will see you in part 2.